we came to talk about exports. Out of our survey respondents, about half were exporting, so this is the number of them in each of the segments there to the left-hand side, and same proportion, again about half that were non-exporters. 75 odd businesses were not exporting. We've asked further questions of those who are not exporting, and I'll sort of talk about those in a moment. We went further and asked those firms that were not exporting whether they planned to start exporting. That number, 75 respondents, is the aggregate number there. About 36% of our firms that were not exporting said yes, that they intended to. They had some plans to develop, and then about another 36%, again 27 firms, were thinking about exports. So we've got a little bit more information from those firms about what's the status of answering yes, I'm intending to export, or yes, it's under consideration. My comment about putting that slide up is there's a fair amount of latent interest in this industry about exporting. But because of the sort of size of firms often, and just the small firms that are busy doing what they're doing day to day, there are impediments to particularly smaller firms having the financial capacity, time capacity and staff capacity to be more aggressive in searching out export markets. So I'll sort of talk about that in a moment. Now, who are these firms? Half of the firms that have more than 75% of staff within the state are engaged in exports. So what we're talking about is, by and large, local firms that are interested in exporting activities. I mean, that's an important point for government, because you're dealing with companies that are based here, located here. We've got a headquartered company here, or if it's small, it's a small organisation, but there are people who are likely to have a significant invested interest in South Australia. This is where they live, the economy and so on, and quite motivated to engage in export activity. I'd be worried if in fact you got the other sort of picture where the majority of firms that were wanting to export were firms that had the majority of their staff interstate, because that's where the decisions are likely to be made. We asked firms about their growth in export revenue within broad categories, and they're fairly evenly spread there. There have been quite strong growth in a number of firms in export performance. About 12 firms there, more than 50% growth. This can be off a sort of a $500,000 base to $1 million base. It can be off 10 million to 20 million. So it's variable. It differs across the size of firms, but there's some very, very strong growth in export revenues, which are a very positive thing for the future. But also they're sort of generally much stronger across this sector than for the South Australian economy as well. That picture might not hold in the future, but that will be because mining exports out of Roxby Downs will accelerate every other significant piece of data on export performance. We looked at industry revenue. Revenue, as I said, in 2003-04 were about 4.1 billion, and overseas exports, so overseas exports not interstate, were around about 656 million in this industry, or about 16% of revenue. By 2006-07, revenues have risen from about 4.1 to 4.3 billion, and total overseas exports are up at 21.5% of the industry revenue, or 931 million. Now, one of the things I think the ICT Council was asked to do was to provide some information to government about the projected value of overseas exports out to 2014. Not sure, I'll just go forward, it doesn't appear on the bottom of that slide, so because there might have been too much on the slide, but for the projected value of overseas exports out to 2014, at a growth rate of exports of 8.9%, would see this industry currently exporting 931 million at 1.7 billion, And a growth rate of exports at 11.4% would see the industry out at about $2 billion worth of exports. So the other little piece of information that I'm sorry that I'm missing from the bottom of that slide there. One of the reasons I think that was requested is the Export Council and government has some particular targets. We want to really assess sort of current growth rates, and are they likely to be preserved into the future? And if they are, then what would be the value of overseas exports out to 2014? Our conservative estimate is that we project growth rate of exports at about 8.9% or around about $1.7 billion from this industry.